Well, hello everyone, it's John Laughland here. I'm the director of Forum for Democracy International. Welcome to this week's forum. I'm delighted to be joined by two friends, George Szamuely in Budapest and Kit Klarenberg, who's normally based in Belgrade, to discuss repression in Britain. We had my colleague and I think also friend Ulrike Guéraud on recently to discuss repression in Germany. So it's only fair that we should concentrate also on our own country. And as it happens, all three of us are British nationals who have been held at ports, at I think in all cases, airports on the way back into our own country, the United Kingdom. And the most recent person to join the club is George. So George, welcome to the club. It's not a very exclusive club anymore, unfortunately. It seems to be getting larger and larger. It's been growing now for several years. Tell us what happened to you, George.
Well, I'm very honored to be among such illustrious club members. So I flew into Heathrow. It was around March the 24th, and it was a personal visit. I was just planning to spend 4 days in London. And I was met there by, right away, almost ready, as soon as I got off the airport, I was met there by, it seemed like 7 people, I'm not sure, but it seemed like a number of people were there to greet me. They said, show us your passport. And then almost immediately they led me away, down through one corridor, another corridor, to a room in which they began to interrogate me. Now, even before the interrogation began, they put me through a number of kind of almost humiliating ordeals. They patted me down meticulously, kind of, from toes to head. And they took out everything that was in my luggage, hand luggage, other luggage. Everything was gone through. They looked at my wallet, went through everything in my wallet. They went through everything in my pockets. And then, of course, they took fingerprints, which took a great deal of time because their computer system really doesn't work terribly well. So every time they take a print, he says, no, you have to do it again, then again it fails. Then they took DNA samples through kind of entering my mouth. And then they took photographs, like it was essentially kind of 9 photographs. It was a 360-degree turn that I had to do, so front to back. And then there was the interrogation, and of course I didn't bring my computer with me, and I had a bad feeling going in that this might not be a particularly happy visit, so I didn't bring my computer, and I brought just simply a burner phone. There was no phone, and of course they confiscated the phone. They wanted, of course, the password to the phone, and then they started interrogating, like, why am I here? Who am I going to visit? And the purpose of all of the questions is always that it leads on to the next question. So you ask a question and then you give an answer, and then that leads to the next question. And they give you answer that, and that's the next question. So it's this constant attempt really to get as much information out of me as possible. It really is like being interrogated by the secret police. You always think, well, they're only asking questions in order to get information about other people, so they can, then we can take them down. Who is this person? Where can we get hold of him? And so on. So it was made clear to me, and I'm sure as it was to both of you, is that you have to cooperate. You don't really have a choice. So under the Section 3, they give you this little handout under Section 3 of the Border Security, Counterterrorism and Border Security Act of 2019. We're entitled to hunt down hostile actors engaged in hostile activity. And of course, right away, you kind of wonder, what's hostile activity? How do you define hostile activity? But they just don't feel they have to define anything.
Well, the act actually says that you can be interrogated and held under that act, whether or not there is hostile intent. So it's true, it says hostile intent on the label, but the actual wording of the Act gives them complete free rein. There's no requirement at all for them to even suspect hostile intent. It's one of the most sinister things about this text.
Yes, that's right. And then, given that, and then they make clear, well, you have to answer our questions. But they did say, well, if you want, you can call a solicitor. And then I said, well, I don't want to call a solicitor. And then later on, after about an hour, a supervisor comes in. I think that's according to the way they work it. So after an hour, in comes the supervisor to make sure that everything has been made clear to me and everything else. And then the supervisor says, well, I noticed you said you didn't want a solicitor. Is there a reason for that? I said, well, I don't think there's a reason. I don't feel I'm in any legal jeopardy, so why should I have a solicitor? So this went on, just one question after another, and and so on, and of course it's made clear that it's all going into the data bank, and then finally they released me. Now, I want to say that the way they conduct their interrogation is actually almost ingratiating.
Yes.
In their friendliness. I mean, they don't try to bully you. They don't threaten you. They're almost going out of their way to be your friend. They say, well, if somehow, well, this hurts us more than it hurts you, and everything.
Yeah.
Are you all right? Would you like a glass of water? Would you like a cup of tea? Would you like something to eat? And so it's all the time as if somehow, are you feeling all right? You need any medical attention? So it's kind of a passive aggressive thing, because they're trying to win your trust in order that they can get more out of you, so you can relax, and therefore you'll give them more. But in the end, I mean, I was there for 4 days, and I came on late Tuesday afternoon. I left early Saturday afternoon, and there they were to meet me at the airport. Oh, here's your phone, and they gave me back the phone. Now, of course, I have no faith whatsoever that there wasn't spyware installed on the phone. So basically, I got rid of the phone. But throughout my days in London, I was very concerned. I mean, all the time concerned. Will they let me out? Will they, essentially arrest me on the way out at Heathrow? So I tried not to communicate with anyone, tried not to go online or anything, just give them, the authorities, nothing that they can then use against me.
I'll talk a minute about my own experience. What about you, Kit? You had the treatment some time ago, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, it was May 2023. I was flying back for the first time. It was the first time I'd been back in the UK in over a year, I think. And I was flying back because I'd received some rather tragic news about an elderly relative who's rather unwell. Now, I similarly had a team of armed police waiting for me on the tarmac. They were checking everyone's IDs. And then when they saw mine, a rather gruffly voiced, Northern Irish accented undercover police officer, you can imagine what he was up to in the 70s and 80s in Northern Ireland, invited me to the back of the airport. I was met there by two agents of allegedly of SO15, which is the counter-terrorism directorate. I wasn't allowed to know their names. It was rather farcical because they forgot each other's call signs. And it's like, are you B1 or C3 today? But then you have this kind of cavalcade of questions which they warn you in advance might be irrelevant, such as how much is my rent and are my energy bills included in my rent? But then also really, in my case, very, very intense questions about whether the grey zone, my employer, has a secret agreement with the FSB to publish hacked information, which I almost laughed at. But it's not funny at all. They genuinely seem to think this was true. I had to answer a lot of questions about my personal and professional background. It felt like the world's most unpleasant job interview. It must be stressed. They still have my a memory card that they took off me. I'm not sure what was on it of interest to them. And as far as I'm aware, I'm still under investigation. Now, I had similarly had the shoes off, DNA swabs, photo treatment as well. It's very unpleasant. You're told I was told if your DNA hasn't been found on an IED in Afghanistan, we will delete it in 12 months' time, which is not particularly reassuring. It must be stressed. But yeah, I mean, the whole experience was quite traumatizing. It must be said. And I, like George, had to go and collect some of the things that they took from me, at an airport. And I was very heartened by how many people spoke up for me. Of course, the National Union of Journalists in the UK did issue a statement in solidarity with me, which they then deleted. Again, encouraging stuff. But yeah, I mean, I was very surprised by how, funnily enough, mainstream media outlets in the US took a considerably greater interest than the UK. And I appeared on The Hill, of all places, to talk about what my experience. I thought that the negative backlash might serve as a disincentive to doing more of this. No, I mean, like you said, it's a very big club. That they're stopping people very regularly. I know a number of people, including rather quiet, kind-hearted academics who don't want to publicize this, who've been harassed and detained, and and I mean, you mentioned, George, that you weren't threatened. My friend Steve Sweeney, who recently graced the airways of Tucker Carlson because he narrowly avoided being killed in an Israeli airstrike in Lebanon. He was straight up threatened. Like, he was told by the police, we know where your family lives. We can raid them at any time. That sort of thing. And I think that what's really quite extraordinary is this does fly completely under the mainstream radar. I can't think of any mainstream media attention being given to any other examples of this, but and increasingly it is applied to people on very, very dubious grounds. This week, a trial that the British media is not allowed to report on, particularly of Palestine Action activists. These are people. Palestine Action is now prescribed under the Terrorism Act, of course. A trial of several activists who were accused of terrorist offences has started this week. Now, with the retrial 2 days away on April 11th. A spokesperson for the group was detained returning to Britain through an airport like us. So I mean, they're just carrying on doing this and probably getting bolder all the time. And I might add as well, there have been numerous legislative movements in the direction of greatly enhancing these existing very vague powers. Now, John, you mentioned how the legislation is worded in such a way that even if you're not suspected of being a state threat or whatnot, you can still be stopped. It goes even deeper than that. Like the information, the helpful information sheets that I was given specifically states you can be considered a state threat whether the state you're acting for knows you're acting on their behalf or whether you yourself know you are. So I mean, it's really creating a suspicionless, almost victimless, suspectless crime. It's very, very disturbing. And then, I believe it was late 2023, there was the UK national, it might have been 2024, it was the National Security Act was passed in the UK, which has all manner of very vague, very, very Orwellian passages. And I wrote at the time that I think this will result in people breaking the law and facing very severe penalties without knowing, wanting to, intending to. It's deeply disturbing, to say the least.
So the most Orwellian part of my experience, and I'm interested in what you've just said, George, is that at the beginning of the conversation that I had, the officer said, "You are not under arrest, and therefore you do not have a right to a lawyer." I was, of course, being held against my will in a room in Gatwick Airport without my passport, without my wallet, without my phone, and therefore unable to leave the airside because I hadn't even crossed the border at that point. So the idea that I was not under arrest, or at least was not being detained in some way, was obviously completely wrong. But I'm intrigued that they offered you a lawyer, because they specifically said to me that I couldn't have one. Kit, were you held for only an hour? Did you get out after an hour like me and George?
Well, I'm sorry.
Oh no, I mean, sorry.
Go ahead, Kit.
No, sorry. Yeah, no, I was there for 5 hours. Like I was specifically told we'll try and get you out as quickly as possible. But no, I was there for 5 hours in this kind of airless, very hot room with occasional water. I was allowed to buy some overpriced Burger King food, which was not great. But I mean, the maximum they can hold you for is 6 hours. The difference is I was told, yes, I'm not under arrest, which means I don't have a right to silence. I likewise had the ability to call a lawyer if I wanted to. And the fact that I had my lawyer's number, or the fact that I had my lawyer's number written down on a piece of paper was very suspicious to them. It was just a card that I have in my wallet, and they were asking, why have I got this written down?
Amazing. George, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, altogether from start to finish, I think it was about 3 hours. So it wasn't 5 hours, but it was 3 hours for the interrogation, going meticulously through my luggage and all of the fingerprinting and all the questioning. But I was interested what Kit was saying, which is, they're very anxious to know about your sources of income. That was they're constantly asking, well, where you get your money from, how do you pay the rent, and it's that very that's really what they're trying to get at. Where are you getting your money from? Are you on the payroll of any governments?
Yeah.
And this is the thing. Now, I had been to Belgrade. I think about a week or so before this trip to London, and right away they want to know, well, whom did I see in Belgrade? And when I said, well, it was just a personal visit, they said, well, who did you see? Well, what was your reason for it? Everything is always about, how do I get more out of you? So
Yeah.
once I get one name, hey, well, maybe I can get another name. Now I can find out, well, who does he work for? What is his angle? That's why it's the whole experience. It's very creepy, because you're all the time you're trying to be cooperative. I mean, you want this thing to be over as quickly as possible, but you also at the same time have to be very careful that you're not getting other people into trouble.
Yeah, I mean, I pursued the issue a little bit after the whole event. I was only held for an hour, and there was a whole thing about how after 1 hour there's a sort of stage of 1 hour, and then you go to a stage of 6 hours. I must have misremembered. I thought after 1 hour you were formally arrested, but maybe it's after 6 hours. But they made a big thing of being very procedural about it. But one of the things that cropped up in my case was that about 6 months later, I received a request, or rather a notification, that the information on my computer was going to be copied, and they were going to keep a copy. Well, of course, I imagined that they had done that anyway. It seemed to me that was the reason why they seized it, obviously, as they did. And I, just for a laugh, I contested this, and there's a ridiculous, totally sort of hypocritical appeals procedure, which you do online. And my appeal went through in front of two very senior judges. One of them was a member of the Privy Council, and the other was had been a judge on the Supreme Court of Scotland. So these were not sort of traffic magistrates. These were quite senior judges. And they both said, I, of course, got very pompous and said, this would never stand up in a court of law and things like that, presumption of innocence and so on. And their answers to my Rumpole-like objections were very illuminating. They said, no, they said, you're not suspected, you're not accused or even suspected of anything. You're not suspected, still less accused of anything, they said. Instead, they said, you might be connected, or you might be linked, or you might be in touch with people who might be practicing interference. So there are two conditionals. I might be in touch with somebody who might be doing something. It wasn't even clear what the thing was or whether it was illegal. In other words, what that shows is that the act was drafted and is used precisely for phishing, precisely for what you say, George. That it's just to find out stuff. It's not. It doesn't, and that's why I draw attention to the fact that in the Act it doesn't say that you have to. That the police have to think you are you have hostile intent. That's not one of the conditions at all. On the contrary, it is used, and the judges have confirmed this, just for finding stuff out.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. No,
Kit, you mentioned the FSB, and George, I believe you do work for RT. I, of course, was asked about Russia. I assume, George, you were asked about Russia. Is that? Am I right about that?
The way they asked it, they said any foreign government. So they asked, do I work for the Russian government? Do I work for the Chinese government, the US government? So they didn't get in any way specific. It's like whether you're working for any governments. So there was never any real. They never had anything very specific that they wanted to suggest that they had suspected me of. So. That and then whenever I asked, I think I asked about twice, why have you selected me? Why of all the people who came off that plane, why did you choose me? Is that routine, and they absolutely refused to explain why were they waiting for me? If it was routine, why not pick on someone else? They never explained anything like that. So and I think that's part of their thing. We're just looking for hostile actors, doing hostile things, and they don't feel any obligation to explain themselves or to suggest, well, what exactly are you accusing me of? Why have you selected me? And I think that's the whole point, that they're not actually accusing you of anything specific.
But Kit, you're an expert on the security state, on the British security state. I mean, this is obviously the people who are driving it, isn't it? I got the impression that the questions that I was being asked by, as you said, George, these very overly polite, or at least in one case, overly polite police officer, that they'd been dictated from Vauxhall Bridge Road. Is that your understanding as well, Kit?
Well, yeah, I mean, I must say as well that this only dawned on me much later, but at various points, my interrogators left the room, and I'm assuming that they were directly coordinating with MI5 and or MI6. And I know there's another wrinkle here to add. There's another wrinkle here to add as well, which is at the Grey Zone recently, we've reported on some newly leaked emails, which show my dear friend Paul Mason, who's this kind of celebrity, a Trotskyite journalist, ex-BBC and Channel 4, who's gone rather derangedly Russophobic and pro-NATO in the twilight of his years. We now know was directly coordinating with the National Cybersecurity Centre, which is this kind of component of GCHQ. He was feeding them information on me, and in the sincere hope that I would.
I've lost Kit. Have you lost him as well, George?
Yes, I have.
A very interesting passage in some of this newly leaked correspondence. He was talking about how the Politico in the summer of 2022, right around the time I was writing about him, they approached me and asked me to comment on a story. They said they were interested in what I'd written. I was expecting it to be a hatchet job, and lo and behold, they actually weren't particularly interested in my stories and their content. They were more interested in where I got them from. Now, based on these newly leaked emails, it's clear that Politico was put up to this by GCHQ. They were fed this story and told to pursue it and try and interview me. And so, I mean, that was, the news value there was a private briefing, behind closed doors to supposed journalists. So I mean, in looking back on it, I think that this was a kind of perhaps kind of preemptively trying to justify state action against me. Publishing this. So if and when I got stopped, this piece could be cited as proof that, because it did kind of it had to be revised several times because it falsely claimed that I had, it kind of implied very strongly that I'd somehow been involved in the acquisition of hacked information, which is just completely untrue. That was subsequently removed after I raised a stink about it. But I mean, in the wake of me getting stopped, there were several people who shared this Politico article saying this isn't a journalist who's being stopped, So, I mean, again, that kind of implies a heavy degree of coordination. It was, by that stage, it was well known that I didn't live in the UK. I did around the time I was reporting on Paul Mason's emails, I got invited to a police interview to discuss allegations of breaches of the Computer Misuse Act, but that didn't seem to go anywhere. So, I mean, I was kind of prepared for something like this to happen, but the sheer scale of it was quite extraordinary. And yet, they are very, very interested in trying to probe your state connections. Their veneer of politeness and sincerity kind of slipped a bit when they were asking me in rather grave terms, staring at me very intently, like, so have you had any contact with Russian government officials, and blah blah blah, and yes, much like George, being intensively grilled on the kind of people that I hung out with in Belgrade. I had cameras with me, and which they were very interested in, and they were specifically asking me questions like, how often do you bring your camera out with you? How do you carry it? Which is, I mean, it's just so sinister. I mean, it was like they were, in the spirit of fishing expeditions. They were desperately trying to assign, sinister resonance and significance to, mundane items, in my possession. I mean, I take photos of architecture in Eastern Europe. I have done for many years. I mean, the idea that there's anything, spectral or sinister about that is really quite extraordinary. And one of the reasons they ended up keeping property of mine was they were scanning various camera memory cards that I had. Pity whoever picked the short straw and had to go over my holiday snaps. But I mean, again, as farcical as it is, there is a very serious point to be made here, which is that as I say, this is being expanded to an ever increasingly large proportion of the population, and it is quite clear that it can come down to something like simply expressing the quote unquote wrong opinions online, or that is sufficient grounds for you getting stopped these days.
I had a wonderful moment, also very Orwellian, when they said, it wasn't at the beginning, I think it was, I can't remember at what stage it was, but they said with a sort of slightly sadistic smile, they said, what do you think about the war in Ukraine? And obviously it's not a question you can give a very quick answer to. There's lots to say about it. So I paused for a bit as I was trying to work out how to answer that question. And the officer said, don't worry. He said, you can speak freely. We're in a free country, Not everybody is that lucky.
Right. I should say, incidentally, John, now that you mention it, they did exactly that with me. Like, well, what do you think about what's going on right now? What's your take on the world affairs? And then, so I tried to give as bland an answer as possible. Nothing. Well, it's peace is always the best thing. We really need to strive for peace. And war is always undesirable. That's it. So they were hoping that I would say something. I really support Putin, or I really support No. It's just basic. We the most important thing is we all pursue peace.
And have you been back since, Kit? Since May 2023?
No, I haven't. I mean, the prospect of it doesn't appeal. It must be stressed, and it's, I mean, I specifically said it. I mean, I was kind of very, very flattered at the time, because I had people like John Pilger reach out and tell me, kind of encourage me not to give up, because there was a period where I was seriously considering giving up journalism. As a result of this, because I mean, if it means that I can't see my family and friends in my country of birth, then that's not that's kind of rather suboptimal. But we have continued. I mean, and as I mentioned that Palestine Action ongoing kind of rather scandalous retrial. The Grey Zone has published on this, and I believe it was on Sunday, April 12th. And this is reporting information that the British media is basically not allowed to report on by court order. I mean, I can imagine that one way or another, that story alone, which is one of a great many that we've published, over the past almost coming up to 3 years since this happened. They have an enormous amount of things that they probably like to ask me about or conduct fishing expeditions on, and if not parlay that into potential criminal charges, because like I say, that National Security Act, it kind of passed without much in the way of media condemnation or even alarm. There were press organizations were silent, despite the fact that the government's own lawyers stated it would create a chilling effect because journalists would be worried about publishing certain things and they would think, well, this is not worth the bother, even, it's not worth the risk. And all of the parliamentary debates around this were absolutely extraordinary. And they were like, you had British MPs like openly stating the reason we're doing this is to prevent another WikiLeaks from happening. And
yes,
and there was a lot of anger and contempt towards people like Julian Assange and Edward Snowden expressed in Parliament. It's quite clear, that where their loyalties lie. That's why when we at the Grey Zone get compared to WikiLeaks, I mean, it's flattering, but it's also deeply worrying because this is deeply serious. And I think that particularly, I mean, in the current milieu, the British government is passing all manner of absolutely extraordinary law without much in the way of pushback from civil society, let alone the media itself. The historic restrictions on protests, which took centuries to win, are just being overturned on with all manner of new regulations and legislation, etc. And this comes at a time when the British government is formally committed to preparing the country for war. And such is the way of these things. When you prepare for war, then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and you get that. So yeah, it is very worrying, and I've been effectively, living in. It's kind of become a bit of a meme, that I live in exile. But I mean, there's nothing funny about it at all. It's deeply serious. I know a great many. Journalists and activists and research, even as I say, like even academics who are now frightened to go to the UK because they don't want to go through the kind of experience that we had. And I think that all we can do is just try and publicize this as much as possible, because the mainstream media is not going to do it. In many cases, the victims themselves don't particularly want anyone knowing, and it is a source of trauma and for them. So I mean, I can kind of understand that, but I mean, I would imagine this is just going to become very, very, very standard. And there's a lot of dissent in the UK at the moment, and a lot of legitimate grounds for people to be unhappy. This will, speaking out under your own name online, or writing articles that irritate the British government, you're going to be fair game.
Yeah, my understanding is that the Act was brought in after the Skripal business in Salisbury. I mean, it was 2019, so Skripal was 2018, and obviously that would have been a good way to sell it. Hostile actors. If only we'd been able to, question Borisov or whatever his name was, and the other guy before they went through passport control. But yeah, I mean, it's very obviously designed to intimidate. One of the academics, I'm not sure if that's the person you're thinking of, Kit, was, as I learnt recently from Ian Proud, is Robert Skidelsky, Lord Skidelsky, who is, as far as I know, so far from being any kind of agent or hostile actor that it's it just makes the whole thing grotesque. But yes, of course, it's designed to intimidate, and in a way, I mean, I don't think George Galloway has been intimidated, but he, as I'm sure you both know, he had the treatment, and he has indeed put himself in exile. I've been back several times. I went back about a month after I went a few weeks actually after the time this happened to me. Later on in that same month, in October 2022. And was held briefly at Calais. We were driving from France, and we were stopped briefly at Calais and asked to wait for about 15 or 20 minutes. I was with my wife and children, but phone calls were made, and I was waved through in the end. And I've been back 3 or 4 times since then without any let or hindrance. I mean, Apart from the horribleness of it, and both of you have used the word trauma, and I think it's important for people listening to us or watching us to know that it is actually traumatic, because even if nothing happens to you, nothing, obviously there's no violence or anything like that, there is a sort of metaphysical violence, isn't there, in having everything taken away from you. I didn't have DNA taken or fingerprints, but the mere fact of having all your possessions taken from you, your phone, your wallet, your keys, everything, is it's a bit like being undressed, I suppose, in an interrogation cell. And although at the time it was very late in my case, it was 11 o'clock at night, and I wanted to get to bed. I wanted to get to my hotel. There was a train strike, by the way, the following day, and I ended up getting with a minute or 30 seconds to spare the last train up from Gatwick to London. But several days later, the traumatic aspect of it kicked in, even though at the time I just kept saying to myself, which is what I genuinely thought, that the whole thing was totally stupid, and I just wanted it to be over, and it was just a waste of time. But there is trauma involved. It is a horrible thing, and particularly if you're held for longer than I was.
Yeah, it's no question. And as I said, that I was there for 4 days. Throughout those 4 days, I was extremely nervous. Really, I was looking over my shoulder. Am I being followed?
Yeah.
Because I had to give a detailed itinerary of what I was going to do during those days. Okay, so what are you doing on Wednesday evening? What are your plans for Thursday? So anything at all that I did, I look over my shoulder. Is somebody following me? I don't know. Maybe they were. So and so you go through this. Don't communicate, and you're aware all the time in London. You're always aware. Closed circuit cameras. People are following you. People may well be just following anything that you say. And then at the end, like Kit, I'm thinking, well, am I going to go back? I really am very wary about returning, because I think the same thing will happen. And this time, they may have more information. They may have more information with which to confront me. Maybe the interrogation may be worse. I haven't done anything wrong, but they may well have, gathered together more information with which to confront me, and it might end worse than last time. So I'm kind of very wary of returning to England, where I spent my youth. Went to school, university, everything. That was where I grew up in London. So it's kind of sad, that I can't go back.
Yeah, well, I mean, as you know, and also from the European Union sanctions, which we've discussed on this forum a couple of times, and I've discussed on other podcasts. You said a moment ago, George, I haven't done anything wrong, but that doesn't count, because the EU sanctions and the British sanctions, which are more or less copied from them, are quite explicitly intended to sanction people who have not done anything illegal. This is in the texts. It's in the EU Council decisions. It's in the rulings on that guy Graham Phillips, who lives in Donetsk or wherever. The fact that you've done nothing wrong is no defense, because it's precisely intended, the point I made earlier about the hostile intent. The sanctions are precisely intended, as indeed a German government spokesman said the other day, they're intended to change behavior, to force people to change behavior. They're not intended to catch any criminals or prevent illegal action.
That's right, and it's the most tyrannical regime imaginable, because you haven't done anything wrong, you haven't been prosecuted, you haven't gone through the usual criminal process whereby you can challenge your accusers, challenge the evidence against you. They just make these rulings and then they punish you. So it's like punishment, really, without any kind of a trial. And of course, this happened with a number of people. The EU just issued these sanctions, and lo and behold, suddenly their bank accounts were frozen.
Exactly.
So, and this is what is so terrifying about this way of going about things.
Kit.
I mean, if I excuse me, if I could just weigh in on this. I've been following the cases of people like Hussein Dogru and Jack Bauer, who've been sanctioned by by the EU. I mean, that is absolutely astonishing. And again, there is, I mean, and very frightening. And there is like a total media blackout on it. I mean, and you read the justifications and the arguments, quote unquote, that are used by the EU Council and the EU Commission in justifying this stuff. They explicitly state that you can be sanctioned for colluding or conspiring with the Russian government, even if we cannot demonstrate, quote unquote, current links with the Russian Federation. So if
that's in one of the Dogru rulings.
Yeah. And it's like, if you appear on RT TV, or did so many years ago, this could be claimed to be a link with the Kremlin, I'm sure. And it repeatedly states that, well, this does not concern, this concerns non-illegal behavior.
Yes.
And I mean on top of that aspect to it, like the results are absolutely devastating. I mean, until he managed to secure a waiver. I mean, it was illegal for his wife to buy him food from the supermarkets. Sure. It was illegal for people illegal for him to buy basic essentials. He couldn't access his own money. And this is again gone entirely under the mainstream radar. German ministers have kind of laughingly justified this. And I mean, and this is at a time when well, we've just seen the end of Orban, or at least an abrupt pause on his rule in Hungary. And the first thing that Ursula von der Leyen says is, well, we're going to get rid of qualified majority voting.
Exactly.
We're going to get rid of veto power. And this is against the backdrop of the EU using the Digital Services Act to threaten social media companies to suppress or censor content and ban accounts which they acknowledge are not doing anything wrong. They just don't like the content. And this has happened in Romania. We saw in November 2024, they just overturned the results of the election due to false claims of Russian meddling, because it looked like the wrong person was going to win. Similar powers have been used in Moldova, in their most recent election, which was a total swindle. And this is going to keep getting worse. Not least because Eurosceptic voices don't really exist within the EU anymore. At least they're not allowed, they're not permitted to.
Yes, and if they do start to be heard, they will be, of course, accused of being Russian voice puppets. The Dogru case is, as you say, Kit, is particularly frightening because he's now been, as you know, through various appeal procedures, and each time there's a new judgment, it's worse than the original. The totalitarian nature of the thing is confirmed. But in his case, I suppose the most flagrant thing is that, as far as I know, I don't know him or anything, or really anything about him, except what's happened to him since he was sanctioned. But he has precisely nothing to do with Russia. Does he? I mean, he's a German of Turkish origin who writes about Gaza. It's got literally nothing to do with Russia, and yet he has been sanctioned, as you say, under the 2024 EU Council mechanism, which specifically deals with destabilizing activities conducted by Russia. But why is it, if you're against the Israeli operation in Gaza, what the hell's that got to do with Russia? Nothing. That's why I asked earlier about Russia. I asked you both the question about Russia, because this whole, I mean, I'm sure we all agree that the whole Russia thing is, Russia derangement syndrome. But I wonder to what extent they can really believe this nonsense. Do they really believe that there is this amazing influence or destabilizing activity being conducted from the Kremlin? Because I certainly can't see it. I think I would have known about it if I knew about it. I mean, if it existed. It seems to me to be complete nonsense.
It is complete nonsense, but of course, that's how you mobilize a population. In the case of Russia, particularly in Britain, there is such deep Russophobic animus that underlies much of British society, especially among British elites and the media. It wasn't very hard to whip up anti-Russia hysteria. I mean, it's been going on for a long time. It long preceded 2022. And, there was the Skripals and a lot of stuff before that. So, you can just simply say Russia and everybody falls into line, anytime, any minister can come along and say, oh, the Russians are doing something or other in the English Channel, and all the media just, foaming at the mouth, denouncing what the Russians are doing in the English Channel. Oh, the Russians are destroying.
Well, we had it in Budapest in the week before Sunday's election. We had plenty of reports saying that Budapest was crawling with GRU agents and that they were going to rig the election.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And now you've got these, I think, rather dumb Hungarians going around screaming "Ruski Haza," Russians go home, as if somehow there are Russians around. I mean, these are people who've never seen a Russian in their lives. You know, they don't know anything about it, but they've been told that there are Russians. Russians are ubiquitous. They're somewhere all around. Where are they? Well, no one can see them, but there must be around somewhere. And I think that the Hungarian case is very interesting because this new leader, Peter Magyar, he's going to make this a key part of his platform. I mean, they are going to have corruption trials. Without question, they're going to put Orban on trial. I think they're going to put all the people around Orban on trial, but it could be more serious than that. I think they're going to have treason trials. And I think that some of the people around Orban will be tried for treason. And that's why I think the Russian thing, and it's very interesting, during his news conference, he came back again and again to the subject of Russia. And particularly when he suggested that Peter Szijjártó, the Hungarian foreign minister, is in the process of destroying documents. He's shredding documents. What documents is he shredding? Oh, about sanctions. That somehow these are sanctions documents. Hungary had been ignoring sanctions against Russia, and documents implicating him in some kind of collusion with the Russian government. There's no question. I think there are going to be people who are going to be put on trial for treason.
I think that's a very good point. I hadn't really thought that through, but I'm sure you're right. That rings very true. Kit.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is an ongoing story, and I think, I mean, in terms of us all having things in common, I think we've all written about like the sham of quote unquote international justice. You know, first around the ICTY, and then it's all of its progeny like the ICCC, etc. It's like, I think that determination still exists, and I mean there was a tremendous flap when I believe it was like George Clooney and his wife said that they were going to start personally prosecuting quote unquote Russian propagandists, and then had to issue rather embarrassing mea culpa saying, oh no, we're not going to be doing that. But yeah, I'm absolutely certain that this will increasingly be used against any and all dissidents. And the fact of the matter is it's quite shocking to me that we're now almost a decade on from the start of Russiagate, which was has been amply exposed again and again and again as a total farce, farce and fraud. But people do still fall for this. Now, I mentioned the Romanian election and how that was annulled in late 2024 due to bogus claims of Russian meddling. What's quite extraordinary, I believe it was in February, the US Senate Judiciary Committee, they published this very detailed report on the use of various different censorship mechanisms by the EU.
Sure.
And it delves into how the Romanian coup was pulled off. TikTok, where this alleged Russian campaign in support of Calin Georgescu, the outsider who was en route to win the presidency in the second round before they cancelled the vote. TikTok explicitly stated, we have no evidence whatsoever that there was any Russian meddling at all or any campaign emanating from anywhere to support Georgescu. But the entire media went for this. And there was in the wake of the Romanian annulment in late 2024, the BBC published this absolutely extraordinary report, which was at pains to push this Russian meddling narrative, while kind of acknowledging that, well, an overwhelming majority of the Romanian population do have legitimate grievances that aren't being addressed in the mainstream, and that, this is a short-term solution for a much bigger long-term problem, which is that, people are poor and getting poorer, the population is collapsing, and no mainstream politician or political party is offering these people anything. So I think that trend's not going anywhere. And as history shows us, when in times like this, it is very, very, very common for witch hunts and hysteria to erupt.
Yeah.
I think that the fall of people like Orban, his politics aren't my own, but I still think it's a shame that a dissident voice has been removed from the kind of the mainstream European politics in that manner. I think Robert Fico, who did get shot not long ago for opposing aid to Ukraine, he's probably next in the crosshairs. But I mean, alongside the kind of political level stuff, I think that we'll probably almost, it's almost inevitable we're going to start seeing show trials of journalists and researchers and academics and anyone who doesn't toe the line, and they will be blamed for all of the problems in society. I see the EU I think it was only a few days ago, they published a report warning about the danger of asking questions, because that sows doubt and distrust in the system. And this
sowing doubt and distrust is a security threat now. In the Netherlands, the Dutch Secret Service published a report on what they call anti-institutional extremism. So if you express the view that the national governments are not in fact in control, but that they're, part of a wider network, then that is to put the democratic structures of the state in doubt, and thereby to undermine democracy. Kit, you said about Robert Fico, we've just got, we've got 10 minutes left. I noticed, George, that although the video I saw perhaps predated the election victory, but Peter Magyar saying that he thought the Beneš decrees should be revoked, or at least they'd been a great injustice. And of course, he mentioned particularly Slovakia, and that's obviously, as it were, no coincidence. He clearly wants to declare war, as it were, at least political war on Slovakia, precisely because of Fico's position on Ukraine. And I noticed as well, my conspiratorial mind was triggered when corruption allegations were launched against the Prime Minister of Spain, because he, of course, as we know, has taken a unexpectedly intransigent position on the war in Iran. So yes, I think you're both right that this relatively low-level harassment will no doubt presage much more serious stuff of the kind that you've both suggested. George?
I think very interesting about Robert Fico. So during that 3-hour marathon news conference, he was nothing but ingratiating towards von der Leyen, towards Brussels. Oh yeah, we're gonna meet and we're gonna discuss this. We have to release the funds. Whom did he denounce? Well, of course, he denounced the Russians. Interestingly, he spoke about the difficulties that we had with the Russians in 1944 to 45. So apparently
that was an incredible thing to
Nazi
say. I mean, that's
Hungary
on the par with the Balts.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah, we were the victims of Russian aggression in 44, 45. That's the new EU liberal darling. Oh, so Nazi-occupied Hungary was preferable to liberation by the Red Army. Okay, that's his view. And then he spent quite a lot of time talking about the Beneš decrees. So why is he talking about something that happened 81 years ago? But he other than if you want to pick a fight with
exactly.
This basic, and this is what Orban had been kind of creating, this alliance of states that kind of neutral, or at least non-aligned state, which included Slovakia, Serbia, the Republika Srpska, and of course Hungary was at the center of it. So now he's picking a fight with Fico, but he's also picking a fight with Serbia. He was also very, very, quite nasty about Vučić. It's very interesting that whom is he picking a fight with whom is he trying to ingratiate himself with? I mean, that just goes his priorities. There's nothing Brussels would love more than to have Hungary and Slovakia fighting about something completely stupid, like the status of the Hungarians in Slovakia. There's nothing you can do about it. I mean, we're not going to overturn Trianon, but that's great. Let Hungary and Slovakia, have their pillow fight, but instead of directing their energy against Brussels, they're directing their energy against one another.
Exactly. Yeah, Kit.
I mean, yeah, I do think that by the pricking of my thumb, something wicked this way comes. I mean, Orban, for all his faults, I mean, he did try and create some kind of call it awkward squad coalition regionally, and I think that yes, that he had a very close relationship with neighboring countries, but also like several states in the former Yugoslavia and also Central and Eastern Europe, which it must be stressed that historically these countries have not been overly enamored for the most part with the EU project or NATO. I think NATO particularly, that's been rather forgotten. And in several cases, it required, kind of CIA and MI6 meddling to get these countries in. Now that they're in, there's still, an enormous amount of opposition locally. I think in Montenegro, I saw polls that showed that about 70% of the population don't want to be in it, even though they already are. In that context, what are you going to do? Oh, well, you're going to start jailing people, aren't you? It's pour encourager le autre, and so I mean, yeah. I at the same time, I mean, maybe it's sheer bloody-minded optimism, I'm not sure, but I mean, if you look again historically, it's usually when powers are repressive state apparatuses are on the verge of collapse that they become their most repressive. It's a pity that we have to live through the short term, but I think the long term picture is potentially more positive, not least because this stuff is very difficult to maintain. I think particularly when you're going after average members of the public, which is what this is going to all lead to. I think that people like ourselves are test cases to see what the state can get away with. I mean, again, the UK analogy, a large number of people are being arrested for completely non-violent protests because of their positions on on Israel-Palestine. I can imagine that being that same kind of model being applied to other proxy conflicts like the Ukraine war, etc. Because I mean they don't have any other option. This stuff is unpopular. It is leading to the maybe not the election of governments, but it's certainly leading to the enhanced popularity of parties like AfD, etc., because there are perspectives within European countries that are popular but are just not being represented at all. So, I mean, yeah, I think that we all need to be extremely careful about what happens next and keep publicizing this stuff as widely as possible. But there is a sense of it's always darkest before the dawn. Again, maybe I'm being delusional.
George, last word.
I wish I could be as sanguine as Kit. I think the loss of Orban is a huge blow because all the other groupings like AfD or the National Rally, they're not in power, and it's going to be awfully difficult for them to get into power. I mean, their opposition have got all kinds of mechanisms in place to make sure they never get to power. We saw this with Geert Wilders in Holland. I think they have mechanisms in place in France and Germany. Orban was unique in that he was actually in power. He actually controlled government, so he had sway. He could go to Brussels. He could,
correct,
act as a mediator in the war in Ukraine. He would go to Xi Jinping. He was a formidable figure. Losing him means that nationalist populist alliance has essentially lost a key figure. I think it's going to be very hard to recover from that.
I think that's absolutely right. I think it is a catastrophe. We'll have to wait and see whether it is darkness before dawn, but I think there's absolutely no doubt that it's a catastrophe. George Szamuely, Kit Klarenberg, thank you very much indeed for joining me, and I hope we'll be able to have you both as guests again soon on the forum. Thanks to everyone for listening, and see you again at the same time next week. Goodbye.
God bless you, John. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.